Chiswick House is as fine an example of Palladian architecture as you will find anywhere in England. It was designed by an 18th century nobleman, Richard Boyle, 3rd Earl of Burlington, a man for whom the art of architecture was as established as the Church of England, and its prospects no less certain. "250 years later, things are very different. Chiswick House is in the care of English heritage, a cultural monument of the first importance. But the descendants of Lord Burlington are in no such state. Today, Britain's architects are facing a crisis of usefulness that has nearly half of them unemployed and the rest with little prospect of renewed prosperity. For all but a handful of famous names, the patrician grandeur of Chiswick House might as well be on the far side of the moon.
Every day is a nightmare. The day-to-day existence of the architect is extremely difficult. The worst period of difficulty this century. The whole great apparatus, carefully built up by wise act after wise decision over decades. Everything we've created could quite conceivably fade away, fall away, come to nothing. We have a few years in which we can get this society of ours activated, using the symbolism of architecture, recreate an infrastructure of this country in order to get ourselves into the next century. And we will not achieve that future without architectural imagination, without architects.
It's as bad as I've ever known. It's as bad as partners I had, or retired partners have ever known. And we've had other times, but just as everything has gone. In fact, one of the directors of the developing fund says, well, you know, if you can see your way through this, you'll be all right, but you'll be lucky if you do.
Architects have been decimated. There is a real feeling of architects, let's hate them. You're effectively like a plumber, and you just come in at one moment in the process and kind of plug in your bit, finish it, go away again. I mean, if that's how architecture's seen, then it's the end. I mean, it's the end for architecture as an art.
Few could have foreseen the downfall of the architectural profession. Only 5 years ago, its handiwork rose with the economic boom in a new Babylon. Huge financial services buildings turned modest men into subjects for profiles, interviews, gossip columns, and commercials. Architecture became a willing accessory, an accomplice to a whole culture of design.
Faszinierendes Gebäude. Ja, stimmt. Britischer Architekt.
Today, these vast edifices of steel and glass remain symbols of that confident time. But for many architects, they are only painful reminders of a fall from grace. The headquarters of the Royal Institute of British Architects is the embodiment of a grand professional class. Built in the 1930s, it still reflects the afterglow of a historic grasp of the art of building. But today, its grandeur seems to mock its occupants in their new impoverished state. For with the onset of the recession, it has suddenly become clear just how much power architects have already given away. The clearest evidence that architects have become disempowered is to be seen in their loss of intellectual authority. This became alarmingly clear in 1984, when a sudden and celebrated attack came from an unexpected quarter.
The competition was to do with an extension for the National Gallery. We were chosen as the team to house that wonderful collection. Prince Charles decided to use the opportunity of the 150th centenary of the RIBA at Hampton Court to make his now famous speech about architecture.
Looks as if we may be presented with a kind of vast municipal
practical points of view, the scheme was dead. The reality was a very serious one for us, that the practice suffered enormous damage as a result of that speech. What I think we found is that there weren't any new inquiries. And at a time when Britain was beginning to move into, in the late 80s, a time of tremendous boom, we were out, not available.
The attack of the Prince of Wales on architects, I think, is extremely important because it created a resonance. It had enormous popular appeal, and that was a benchmark, a calibration of the distance the profession had moved from its popular base. I think that's the most important thing that the Prince did.
Suddenly, the profession seemed to lack the confidence to address the issues being raised by the Prince. Where on the other side of the coin, it was building the biggest buildings we've seen in this country probably ever. It was orchestrating the largest real estate boom we've ever seen in this country, which required enormous confidence. So on one hand, the confidence to do that, and on the other side, the obverse, lacking in the intellectual clout to address the issues in question.
50 years ago, architects were seen as people who created a better environment rather than a worse one. To repair the damage of 2 world wars, their numbers were vastly increased. It seemed inconceivable that they would one day be blamed for the way they carried out this huge task.
We were thinking in terms of a new world. The returning soldiers deserved a decent environment, and that was really the main task, and we thought that we'd been called by chance and by our place in history to create that new world. That was what we all felt. When I started as an architect, I used to see the people who did great houses for the rich and all that stuff as what we called prima donnas. And we, young, sort of socially motivated architects, saw ourselves as something quite different from that. We were sort of in the chorus. We didn't see ourselves as creative geniuses, but we saw ourselves as the sort of doctors of the environment, the people who were going to go out there and make it human.
We want a home for every family, whatever its size and income.
And it's up to all women, especially working women, to get together and to insist that we get these facilities at as cheap a rate as possible.
Not only the women, Mrs. Collingbourne. Everyone must insist.
There was an architectural equivalent of the social forces that led to socialism. The architects were riding a kind of wave of social optimism. That is, it was possible to change the nature of the society. And that was the most powerful feeling emerging from the war.
In the post-war years, utopian social architecture was high-value currency in the corridors of power. Alison and Peter Smithson, 2 young intellectual leaders of the profession, became world famous. They designed a school, the headquarters of The Economist magazine, and a radical East End housing estate, all of which became objects of worldwide pilgrimage. In 1971, a BBC film was devoted entirely to their theories about housing.
The site has been split like a kipper, with the same functions on the inside in each building. On the outside, we put the noisy next to the noisy. That is, the walkways or decks and the living room. Away and protected from noise, we place the bedrooms and the kitchens. The kitchens are so planned that a mother can keep an eye on a 2 to 3-year-old child playing out on the access deck on one side, and also from time to time look down on the other side into these play spaces which are intended for the somewhat older children.
But Robin Hood Lane, like so many housing estates of the 1960s, was destined to play host to a Pandora's box of social issues. The idealism of its architect was shattered at the very moment it was brought to completion.
Literally the day it opened, people would come in from the street and shit in the middle of the lifts, which were absolutely brand new, in order to demonstrate that those people had got houses and we didn't have houses. You know, it's so brutal. much more brutal than I'd imagined. Things like the laundry, which was fantastically well designed, and there was 20,000 quid's worth of laundry equipment, it never opened. It was smashed up before it was opened. That is, it was kind of unbelievable. I think it's jolly difficult to live in Robin Hood now, because it's deteriorated due to maintenance problems, and it has a sense of being under attack. And I would find it difficult to live there myself, I think, now.
In the 60s, architects had established for themselves and demanded responsibility for great projects, and therefore put themselves in a position where they were going to be blamed if they went wrong. The failure of the great tower blocks to satisfy human needs was laid at the door of architects, because architects had claimed that role. But inevitably, if you claim a great leadership role, you will get into trouble, like generals do, if they lose battles, even though the battles may have been lost through other circumstances which they couldn't have foreseen.
As the great boom in social architecture petered out, so too did the power and influence of modern designers. The developers of the new privatized economy had no interest in social programs. They needed a new kind of architect who could design awe-inspiring commercial buildings with expensive finishes enclosing huge rafts of office floor space for the new electronic age.
Disenchantment in the 70s gave space for an alternative scenario to present itself. And I think that that scenario drifted in like a great kind of, I think, fairly empty bubble, which drifted in across the Atlantic from the States and has variously been named postmodernism and other names of that sort in architecture.
The cause of postmodernism was that architects wanted to be liked again, and so they plundered images which would seduce the public, re-seduce the public, and by using wit, they felt that they could, show that what they were doing in the postmodern arts. That's what they're about. Unfortunately, of course, a lot of architects aren't very witty, and so the superficiality can backfire on you because, of course, people start to think that's all there is to it. Not whether does it work, but how does it look? And so architects, of course, become style gurus, if you like, or the purveyors of the surface styling instead of the suggestion that they have deeper agenda.
Architects were more than fully employed and very happy to take the money, thank you, I'm sure. It was a great period for them. It's a pity that if we look back in that period, it is hard to think of a single major building in England which one wouldn't want to actually consign to an earthquake. That boom of office building with the heavily serviced floors, glitzy multicoloured buildings populated by Armani-suited young people earning vast sums of money, I think that didn't do architects a great power of good. I think that they became associated with the glib and the trivial, with the snide and the cynical.
The commercial pressures had other implications too. New technology and bigger buildings meant that architects could no longer direct the whole building process. More and more, decisions came to be taken either by developers or by planning authorities. Increasingly, architects were relinquishing their historic position as leaders of the building team and slipping into a new, subservient status.
Certainly, it was a change to the architect, and I think what happened was architects were seduced by that idea that they, having effectively led the team, been the manager of the football team for years, the notion that they should kind of be one of us and just get in there and join the team. It sounded good. And then somebody said, well, now we need a manager. And they invented the project manager, who then came between the architect and the client and told the architect to produce the things which the architect should produce anyway.
This £16 million complex of buildings for the personnel and training branch of the RAF near Gloucester is an object lesson in the changing shape of building and the shifting role of the architect. This job is fast, an 18-month contract squeezed into 11. But although 3 firms of architects have worked on the design, none of them is in charge of the job. The boss is not an architect at all, but a new type of construction professional, the project manager.
Buildings are now becoming more complicated. They're becoming like aircraft. They have a lot more services, pipes, wires, and things like that in them. And the idea of design and build is that you make the construction company responsible for the design as well as the construction. One of the reasons why design and construction has come about is because in the past, the people who have been responsible for managing have not managed. And as a result, problems have arisen, projects have fallen behind time, they've run over cost. A client knows if he signs a contract with us for £1 million, but at the end of the day, his bill is going to be £1 million.
Design build has taken away a great deal of authority from the architect. It must do, because he is a minor player in the whole setup. Other people can do construction drawings, other people can do management. The only thing that an architect does that other people don't do is to design, in the pure sense of the word.
But if project management means guaranteed cost, it also means construction is more important than design. The result is eerily evident in the new deculturalized machine buildings that are beginning to emerge from design and build contracts all over the country. Today, design and build accounts for more than a quarter of all construction work. Analysts expect it to top 40% within the decade. By then, it will have generated a population of monster post-architectural contract-designed buildings whose parade of features will barely conceal their lack of organic design.
I know of no good developer who uses design and build. It's basically clients who haven't got a lot of knowledge about building, who are sold the idea that what they really need is something which can be absolutely assured. Of course, what they're actually getting is usually 90% of the time, a second-rate quality end result.
It's a sign of our times that one of the prime motivators in building is cost. In this particular building, there's a vast amount of information technology, and that has been installed, I would suggest, at the expense of some of the decorative elements that one might find in previous periods of architecture.
Those architects who deal with their work in a professional and competent manner, I think, have nothing to fear from this regime. Those people who wish to maintain their position at the top of the building professional tree purely for the sake of it do have a problem. We don't force architects to work on this type of contract. We ask them if they would like to join the team, and those practices that say yes if they are prepared to accept that different regime.
The value for money philosophy of design and build attacks architecture in other ways. It has subtly diverted the course of Britain's most ambitious town planning project of the modern period.
The new towns immediately after the war were relatively modest, and Milton Keynes was tremendously ambitious, 27,000 acres, enormous, 7 miles square. It was an enormous undertaking. We were very young. We had tremendous utopian ideals. We wanted to do something for the public. And I think, you know, emotion and passion does come across. I mean, it was a massive program. We were trying to get to build 3,000 houses a year, which from a standing start is pretty remarkable.
At Milton Keynes, for the last time, long strips of flat-roofed, terraced housing were deployed across a virgin landscape on a masterful scale. For the last time, every detail of every scheme, from house plan to door handle, was under the control of architectural design.
We quarried half of Portugal to provide ourselves with Portuguese granite, which are the curbs of the city centre. And we designed a whole language of bus shelters and litter bins and lighting posts and so on.
The engine of development at Milton Keynes was a partnership of public and private investment. But with the Thatcher government of the 1980s, public spending was drastically cut back. Derek Walker's vision was one of the first casualties.
One of the reasons that support dwindled was basically that of ideology. The Conservative Party of the 80s were entirely and almost totally wedded to private sector performance at the exclusion of public sector involvement. They could see no good reason, and I think they were very wrong, that a new town could not be developed by the private sector. Private investment seemed to me all the time to breed bottom line architecture. And bottom line architecture really is as cheap as you can make it to get as much profit as you can out of it. And of course that does not make for good architecture.
This is one of the more profoundly irritating parts of the city centre. We're standing here in front of the ecumenical church, and I think it's a terrible chance missed. We've got a piece of classical pastiche with appalling geometry, and really mediocrity is possibly the only word that can describe it. And this is a great deal of sadness. This leisure complex, really put up in the 80s, really encapsulates all the worries I have about that period. A private sector finance building, which is trivial in appearance, which is garish in appearance, bottom line architecture. For an architect to be given today the opportunity and the power and the backing that I was given is inconceivable. And I think this is a tragedy.
Now there is a very different relationship between architects and planners. The rise of the conservation movement has driven a wedge between two professions that once collaborated over new towns and high-rise housing estates. Britain is as conservation conscious in the 1990s as it was modernist in the 1960s. Today's planning committees fiercely defend 5,000 conservation areas. They ensure that architects are kept in a straitjacket of historic building style.
There may be possibilities to put historic interpretation, I suppose, perhaps in a similar way to buildings which used to exist in the medieval times in Westgate Street.
Everything we design has to go before a planning committee, so that is fundamental to the survival of our practice. If a scheme is held up in that planning process, it affects our livelihoods. The butcher, baker, candlestick maker, without being patronising, will try and work out their own prejudices on somebody's design and, in fact, somebody's livelihood. We've designed, for example, a doctor's surgery in a street where it's predominantly Victorian terraced houses. We designed that building with a low-pitch, high-performance metal deck roof, which reduced the volume of the building, saved our client money, which meant he could spend that money in other directions. We proposed that metal deck roof to the planners, and the view was that a metal deck roof was inappropriate because there weren't any other metal deck roofs in that vicinity, and a metal deck roof was what you would see on an industrial shed. We changed to a slate roof, which actually cost our client money. It meant the roof pitch had to be jacked up, the construction was different, the scope for interesting details was lost. I do believe that lay committees should be more educated before they pontificate about specific designs.
I think you need to be very careful before you make the assumption that because a planning committee is made up of lay people, that they don't have a degree of expertise. Members have experience of serving on a planning committee for many, many years. There's a tremendous responsibility which the planning committee, I know, take extremely seriously as custodians of one of this country's most important historic centres. We want to protect the best of the past, but at the same time we want to equip Gloucester to fulfil its modern role.
Gloucester represents a real attempt to turn the clock back. A town half-daringly redeveloped in the 1960s with rooftop car parks, high-level walkways and Corbusian council offices, Gloucester has resolutely turned its back on the future and begun pedestrianising its path. Today, its planners debate rerouting buses and removing modern eyesores with the same zeal as they once demolished 19th century buildings.
Although the planning system's been in existence since 1948, the lack of respect for the architect has sort of grown up during this period. And a system was set up which was never really quite meant just to hammer architects or hammer designs into the ground or make committee decisions on design. But it set up something which could be used like that and is being used like that. The consequence is a style which is called the neo-vernacular. I call it the monster cottage style. And this is the style of the planning system. It's created by the planning system. Nobody really likes doing it very much. But it represents by far the majority of the buildings produced in Britain today. The neo-vernacular supermarket, the neo-vernacular office block, the neo-vernacular house.
Modernist architects always wanted to show how the future can be dealt with and what its real and exciting possibilities are. The British public seemed to be more concerned to turn the whole of Britain into Merry England. This is a kind of a nostalgia, and I think it therefore has to be a fear of the future, an absolute fear of going forward, and that means, of course, taking a risk. What I think is curious about Britain is its hatred of modernism. It's almost as if it's a kind of bad medicine which had to be taken in order to get rid of the sickness of the Victorian time. This isn't, of course, true in almost any other country in the world.
Many planning decisions appear to be driven by that fear, as those involved in building this modern house were to find.
There was a lot of public feeling that, you know, something should be done about dreadful modern architecture. Obviously, we felt that ours wasn't dreadful modern architecture. We were doing it with the best intentions to come and live here ourselves. We weren't trying to sort of make a fast killing on the property market. We were spending a lot of money to get the best materials and to do it as beautifully as we could. One morning we found a paper saying, "Nightmare house to be bulldozed." The Sun listed a lot of things that the house didn't have that were obviously meant to be very bizarre to live in a house that had no curtains and no mantel shelves and no carpet. But obviously Sun readers have lots of things in their house and don't live in a very minimal environment.
I think it was one of those things where sort of latent venom became sort of focused. Prejudices seem to exist more in a sort of tribal way. And, you know, we're obviously in a sort of suburban tribe here. I mean, this house is infiltrated into a suburban tribe and the values that, you know, exist in the suburbs. And that violation was obviously, you know, touched on a whole series of prejudices. If you take this house, everybody that comes to it enjoys it. It's actually rather abstract. It's a series of spaces which have a particular organization, particular prejudice and concern for daylight, and a particular orientation to outside space. And certainly the spatial feeling that you get of being, on the one hand, protected from the outside, and the other hand, given to the outside. And that's something you cannot get in the neighboring houses. Now, it seems to me that that's a freedom which contemporary architecture can give us.
Today, the Royal Institute is like a fortress under siege. its discipline faltering under the strain. Architects accuse one another of unethical conduct. Struggling to survive, they increasingly test the professional code that prohibits them from poaching one another's clients. A recent controversy centered on the refurbishment of Angeltown, a large South London housing estate. A small architectural practice, Burrell Foley, had worked on the redesign of 50 homes after extensive consultation with residents. Their hope was that this pilot scheme would be followed by a £16 million contract to refurbish the whole estate. But to their surprise, another firm of architects, Hunt Thompson, was invited to tender for this second stage. Driven by the need for work, Hunt Thompson not only undercut Burrell Foley's bid, but offered to do the job for nothing.
If we're tendering for a job, we have to consider that job in relation to our organisation. We have to consider the importance of winning that job to our organisation, given the workload that we have at a given time. And we have to make a commercial decision about how competitive we should be on the pricing of that tender. That is the basis on which we submitted a zero-key bid. And all I can say is that, yes, we were competing seriously, and we don't think that there is any other way of competing. We would be wasting our time if we competed any way other than seriously.
What made the Angeltown nil fee bid more surprising was that Hunt Thompson are pioneers of the community architecture movement, which believes in precisely the kind of long-term relationship with residents that Burrell Foley had established. Hunt Thompson also signed an official RIBA protest against cut-price deals being forced on architects by local authorities.
When in fact you're faced, as we were, with a tender bid that came in at 0%, it obviously is a bit more of a friendly rivalry, because it's quite clear if you put in a tender for 0%, you're pretty well certain to get that project. We were very surprised to discover there was a nil fee tender, especially from Hunt Thompson, because they're actually architects that promoted the whole idea of continuity, involvement and consultation with residents, and one would expect they would be a bit reticent about rupturing any relationships that had already been there. And one is left with the question of why would they do that?
What happens to architects in this situation? Desperate for work. They're tempted to do something which I think is utterly wrong, which is to give away their intellectual property, their intellectual birthright, their ideas, their imagination about what ought to be done, their designs, to give that away for nothing in order to buy the busy work that will keep the hands going in the studio. That's why I call it the nil fee bid, a betrayal. It's a symbolic betrayal of the value, of the essence of what we do. That's why it's so significant, why it's so important. If you give it away, it is worth nothing. Then you've said it is not important to society, it is not worth doing, we might as well fold our tents and move away.
I don't see that a zero fee bid is in any way eroding the professional ethic that I believe in, but it does get right up the nose of a lot of architects who believe that architects ought to protect each other. I think, sadly, that protecting each other is probably why we are withstanding competition from others so badly. If we're talking about professional ethic, we're talking about what I think that should mean. It is to do with the standard of service to your client. The world is more sophisticated than architects are really prepared to recognize at the moment, and they've got to wake up, because otherwise the world will just simply pass them by.
Despite widespread unemployment in the profession, there are more architectural students than ever before. These at London University are only a handful of our 9,000 aspiring architects, studying for 7 years, as long as doctors. When they qualify, they could push the number of architects up to 40,000, 4 times as many as served the whole of the British Empire. One wonders, as one sees them earnestly developing their projects in one of Britain's finest schools, what future they see for themselves. Will they retrain as project managers? Will they become conservation officers? Will they in turn become professors and train yet more architects? What role will they play in a construction industry geared to produce a value-for-money, deculturalized environment that is cheaper than the cheapest architecture money can buy? Will they ever even dimly understand the authority, the respect, the power that their forefathers once held in their hands?
This country was seen as being in the vanguard of architectural innovation. I felt like you would feel about being a distinguished surgeon, that you are fulfilling a need which only you can do, and that it's a tremendous honor to be part of such a profession.
There is a saying which I believe comes from the Greeks, which says that citizens who are proud of their cities love their architects. People have always loved construction. I mean, whether it's a sort of primitive hut or the Gothic cathedral, in Chartres, we go to see this amazing moment of technology and religion come marrying together and creating what is one of the greatest buildings that man has ever seen. The idea that you can now today build a sort of paper-thin Chartres is completely ridiculous. Architecture really does not respond to a quick buck mentality.
The profession can only survive this recession if it has a very clear view of its own future. And it worries me that at the moment it doesn't seem to have that. The architectural profession in a re-emerging construction industry will have to stick to what it knows and do what it's good at better. It's the ability to walk in, sit down to a table surrounded by all these grey faces and say, that's what we're going to build. And it takes a hell of a lot of courage to do that, but if they don't do that, then they won't have a seat at that table.
Architects are losing their self-confidence. They're beginning to have their hope in themselves eroded. Damage is being done. What is happening in the architecture profession in Britain today is enormously serious. What architecture is assembling physical resources in order to achieve the future. Now, do we want to afford the future or not? Do we want to imagine what kind of country we want to be in the year 2010 or not? It's not us who matter. It's not architects who matter in this situation. What matters is the future, our collective future, the future of the whole of society. And we will not achieve that future without architects. That's why it's so important.